Welcome to our daily story. Please give me some feedback. If you've listened, don't forget to like and comment below. Megan was finishing her usual evening chores. The house was quiet. It was already past 11 o'clock at night when she picked up a basket of freshly washed clothes and went upstairs. As she passed the bathroom, she noticed a glimmer of light coming from the slightly open door. Sighed, thinking that Nathan, her stepson, had forgotten to turn off the light again. Nathan is often careless about the little things, leaving the lights on, the dishes unwashed, or his belongings lying around. Shaking her head, she reached for the doorknob, ready to turn off the lights. But as she pushed open the door, she suddenly stopped. Nathan was there, sitting on the edge of the bathtub, his shirt off and his sweatpants hanging down his hips. Steam from the running water blurred the mirror and softened the edges of the scene, but there was no mistaking what he was doing. Megan's heart was beating fast, her mind screaming at her to leave, but her feet felt like they were pinned to the floor. Nathan still hadn't noticed her. His head was tilted back, his eyes were closed. Megan's cheeks blushed as she realized the intimacy of the moment. Megan scampered away, muttering something incoherent as she ran back to her room. Closing the door behind her, she leaned against the door, her hands trembling. She tried to convince herself that it was just a harmless mistake, but that moment replayed in her mind again, making her restless and confused. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, Megan told herself to forget the previous night. It was nothing more than an embarrassing mistake. However, as she stood in front of the bathroom mirror combing her hair, she couldn't stop the memory from flooding back. She shook her head, dismissing that thought as she went downstairs to have breakfast. Nathan was already in the kitchen, standing next to the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. He was only wearing a pair of baggy sports shorts, and his hair was messy and looked very casual. "Good morning," he said, voice calm, almost teasing. "Good morning," Megan replied, keeping a neutral tone as she busied herself with the coffee pot. She avoided looking directly at him, but she could feel his eyes still on her. "Did you sleep well?" Nathan asked, leaning against the kitchen counter with a smirk that made her stomach clench. "Yes, fine," she answered quickly, trying to focus on stirring the coffee. But there was something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, that hinted that he hadn't forgotten what had happened. Nathan's usual confidence confused Megan. Not just his words, but also his body language, his relaxed demeanor, and the way he seemed to study her reactions. Throughout the day, Megan found herself losing concentration. That evening, as she entered the living room, Nathan looked up from the couch and smiled. It was a simple gesture, but it made her shudder. One morning, the house was exceptionally quiet. Maga was washing the dishes at the sink when he heard Jack's footsteps behind him. She turned around, expecting a polite greeting, but instead she found him standing closer than usual, his expression unreadable. "You always take care of everything," he said gently, his voice tinged with something she couldn't understand. "I don't know how you can do that." Megan giggled. Jack stepped closer, his fingers touching her wrist as she placed a dish on the drying rack. The touch was fleeting but enough to make her stiffen. She slowly turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. He whispered, his eyes locked with hers. "This is wrong," even though her voice lacked conviction. "I don't care," Nathan answered, his voice low and even. Before she could react, he leaned over and kissed her. For a moment, Megan's mind yelled at him to separate, but her body betrayed her. She felt her resolve crumble as she melted into the kiss, her hands gripping his arms tightly for balance. When they finally pulled away, they were both panting. Jack's forehead rested against hers, his hand still lingering on her waist. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice almost inaudible. But Megan didn't say anything. She couldn't. That kiss marked the start of something they both knew was dangerous, something they couldn't take back. As Megan and Nathan's relationship deepens, the suspense of their secret moments begins to turn to something darker. Nathan's carefree attitude had been replaced by a possessiveness that Megan had not anticipated. One afternoon, while Megan was texting a colleague, Nathan glanced at her phone. "Who saw?" he asked casually, but his tone was somewhat harsh, making her hesitate. "Just a work email," Muthan replied, dismissing it. Nathan didn't ask any more questions, but his eyes lingered on the screen longer than she wanted. Over the next few days, his questions became more and more pointed. He wanted to know who she was texting, why she didn't respond to his texts quickly, and where she was spending her time. Megan finds his jealousy admirable. It was like proof that he cared, that their relationship was more than physical. But soon, it became stifling. One evening, when Megan came home, Nathan was waiting for her in the living room. His jaw was clenched, and his posture tense, made her immediately nervous. "Who's Ben?" he asked, holding up her phone. Megan blinks, confused. "Ben? He's a client. We're discussing a painting that interests him." Nathan's expression didn't soften. "I don't like how he texted you." But Nathan's jealousy did not stop there. One afternoon, when David's secretary Clara stopped by the house to deliver some papers, Nathan's mood immediately turned gloomy. He barely recognized Clara, his eyes narrowing as she politely chatted with Megan. After Clara leaves, Nathan turns to Megan, his voice low and accusatory. "She is here so often. Do you trust her around David?" Megan sighed, the weight of Nathan's jealousy starting to strain their already fragile relationship. She was trapped between his possessiveness and her own guilt, unsure of how much longer they could keep this up. The world Megan has carefully built begins to crumble when Martha, her nosy neighbor, shows up at her door one afternoon. With a smirk and a manila envelope in her hand, she holds the power to destroy everything Megan has tried to hide. "You might want to see this," Martha said, her tone dripping with false politeness. She handed the envelope over and walked away, leaving Megan standing there in stunned silence. Inside were photos, blurred, dimly lit, but unmistakable. Megan's breath hitched as she flipped through each photo, of her and Nathan in the guest house, in the gallery, and even in the kitchen. Each photo tells a story that she tried to bury. The worst picture was taken through the guest house window. The picture shows Nathan leaning over Megan, his face pressed against her neck. There's no denying what's happening. Her stomach turned as she realized how closely Martha must have been watching, documenting every moment. The next morning, Martha cornered Megan in her driveway. "I want the Cranston painting," she says flatly, referring to the gallery's six-figure abstract work. "I can't just give it to you," Megan stuttered, her voice trembling. "Oh, but you can," Martha said, her smile growing wider. "And you will. Unless, of course, you want your husband, and the whole town, to know what you've done with your stepson." Megan clenched her fists, her mind spinning. It was impossible to quarrel with Martha. She had all the leverage. "Fine," Megan said finally, her voice hoarse. "I'll arrange the sale." "Very good," Martha replied, patting Megan on the shoulder to show her approval. Megan watched Martha leave, insult and anger burning in her chest. She had no choice but to comply, but the betrayal had left a wound that she knew would not heal easily. The stress of Martha's blackmail and Nathan's increasing possessiveness weighs on Megan. As if the pressure weren't enough, her doubts about her husband, David, began to surface. His constant late nights and aloof demeanor seemed too convenient to ignore. One evening, when David was locked in the office for another important call, Megan decided to confirm what she had long feared. As she quietly walked into his office, her eyes scanned the desk. His phone, unlocked and vibrating with a new text, caught her attention. The text came from Clara, David's secretary. "Can't stop thinking about last night. See you tomorrow?" Emma held her breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. It wasn't just her imagination. David had been unfaithful, too. She expected to feel vindicated, but instead it left her feeling empty. This revelation does not assuage her feelings of guilt about Nathan, it only deepened the chaos in her mind. When she came back downstairs, Nathan was waiting for her. His eyes immediately fell on her pale face. "What's wrong?" he asked, nervousness replacing his usual sharpness. "Nothing," Megan said quickly, but Nathan didn't believe it. "David?" he insisted, his voice low but determined. Megan hesitated, then nodded. "He is related to Clara." A flicker of satisfaction flashed across Nathan's face, but Megan couldn't share his relief. The tangled web of lies is becoming overwhelming. Emma looked away, unable to look him in the eye. She wanted to believe Nathan, to justify what they were doing, but the weight of it all was weighing her down. Between Martha's threats and David's betrayal, she feels trapped in a life that is losing control. Nathan paused and glared at her. "Martha knows. She stopped by before asking about us, about the guest house. She was playing a game." Megan felt frustrated. "We'll deal with it. Just stay calm." "Keep calm?" Nathan snapped, his voice rising. "She's blackmailing you, and you act like this is normal." Before Megan could answer, David appeared in the doorway, a look of confusion and suspicion on his face. "What the hell is happening?" he asked, his voice icy. Megan, her mind raced to find an explanation, but Nahan spoke first. "Why don't you ask Clara?" he said, his voice full of venom. David's face turned dark, his eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "You heard what I said. You think you're the only one who has a secret?" The tension in the room burst. David rushed at Nathan, pushing him against the kitchen counter. Megan cried out, trying to intervene, but Nathan pushed harder than he intended. David staggered, his foot catching on the edge of the carpet. He fell backwards, his head hitting the corner of the kitchen counter with a loud sound disgusting. For a moment, everything was still. David lay collapsed on the floor, blood pooling under his head. "Oh my God!" Megan whispered, kneeling down next to him as Nathan stood frozen in shock. "Call 911!" she screamed, her hands shaking as she pressed the cloth to the wound. The weight of their actions finally crumbled. There's no turning back anymore. Congratulations for listening to all of our daily stories. If you have any comments, please like and comment below.